of this year's 2015 Griffin Award for his play The Turquoise Elephant. I've asked them to make some observations about the state of playwriting in Australia, whether, you know, that be about funding and kind of policy level, or just about what kind of plays are getting put on, what's out there, what's popular, what are people writing. So, would you like to make a straw?
Firstly, thank you so much for having me. It's a real honour to be here, and I'm sorry that even though I'm 2.5 years into working at Playwriting in Australia, this is my first trip to Tasmania, I hope. Not the last, and I'll be back really soon. I don't want to talk very much about policy if we can avoid it. I think it's very easy to get into the grumble very quickly. There isn't enough money. Let's work within that parameter. In the government, policy is changing as we speak. So, but let's talk about the arts, because I think that's what we do best. We conduct an annual survey of the amount of the new writing landscape at Playwright in Australia. We break down all of the plays that have been produced around Australia and work them out by new play versus adaptation, major theatre companies versus small to indies, gender, cultural diversity, all of those kind of things. And I actually have to say, I think we're in pretty good nick as a nation. I think that it's very easy to start by going, oh, it's terrible. It's always been terrible, and we've always been teetering on the verge of death in every single artistic culture anywhere in the world. My observation as someone who's relatively new to Australia, although I'm an Australian citizen, I've lived most of my life in London, is that the quality of work on the stage in Australia is pretty high. I think compared to London, there are 90 theatres in London. To get your show on in Australia, it's got to be good. And I very rarely, I think, see an absolute catastrophic doozy in a way that you might if you just walk into an off-Broadway theatre. So I think it's rather good. I think there's a growing momentum and confidence in the playwriting community that certainly, even in the last 3 years, I think playwrights are starting to challenge their place within the theatre community and in wider society. And I think it's absolutely one of my biggest aims for Playwriting Australia is that playwrights are cultural beacons, that you can't move in New York without hearing Tom Stoppard say something provocative, Tony Kushner say something provocative, or David Mamet saying something racist. And similarly in Stoppard, Eight-Born Hare in London. But I don't see that happening very much in the Australian cultural climate, and I think that playwrights are the leading inventors of our theatre culture. I think no matter how brilliant your radical reworking of The Cherry Orchard is, Chekhov still wrote that idea. And I said this at the Play Festival, I've never met a director who invented anything. By and large, they are reworking ideas that playwrights have invented. And I think we're starting to find confidence in that within the playwriting community. I'm a director and a dramaturg and a producer. I've not been anything in my entire life, and I don't have the flair and the boldness of imagination to do it. But I think we're starting to see, when you see Van Baden or Nakia Louis on the drum or on Q&A, we're starting to hear more from playwrights, and I get very excited about that. I think the work is battling against its economic confines a little bit. By which I mean, because the amount of money is small, often the ideas in the play are small. The scope of the play and the scale of the play, I think, have become conflated in Australia. And I don't always walk out of a two-hander play thinking that I've absolutely had the ideas of our society wrestled with in a vast dynamic moment. Absolutely there are exceptions, and there are writers sitting around here now who completely challenge that. But by and large, I find myself sometimes yearning for greater ambition within the ideas landscape of the work. I think that for every time I think that I can immediately list 40 playwrights who blow that notion out of the water, but it's quite hard to write something epoch-defining if it's only got 3 people in it. I think of the great plays of the last 50 years from anywhere in the world. They tend to have a big enough landscape to sustain a really complicated meeting idea. I'm aware that that's a slightly controversial thing to say, but I'm going to say that anyway. There are 2 new plays a year in Australia that have a cast size of 8 or more, which is small. You know, so it's a minuscule amount, and by and large, I think plays don't make it into our canon if we don't, if they don't really land something about the world that you're living in at the moment. It's very rare that one of the world's great plays is a four-hander. I think Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and then I struggle to think of what else is on that list. But you think of the massive plays, like the great plays of the Australian canon, from Sewell to Lawler, to I suppose, you know, some of Joe Murray Smith's big stuff, to Williamson's great stuff. They're big, meaty plays, and they require a big landscape. I think I'll stop. I'll hand over to someone else. No, I don't want to leave it. I think there's extraordinary ambition. I think there's brilliant character work. I think the line writing in Australia is as good as anything you'll hear anywhere in the world. I think that writers are starting to re-engage politically with the society that we're living in, and I think that's really exciting. I think that the producing landscape is becoming more responsive to the things that writers are excited to talk about, and I think we leave today in really, really rude health.
And it's interesting, and I was about to say, because it's chicken and egg, isn't it? Because presumably the writers don't want to write the big plays for the companies that want to put them on because the company can't afford to put on the big plays, but of course companies can afford to put on big plays when you can do Mother Courage. And, you know,
yeah, but you see, what you've got is a budget that will sustain, I don't know, 60 actors over the year, 40 actors over the year. You can't do Mother Courage with 4 people.
Yeah.
So as Julian Merrick talks about in his The Retreat of Our National Drama, his paper there, what ends up is the new play ends up getting shafted.
I was going to reference that article as well, because the expectations from inside the companies don't actually measure the way that the audience engages with the work. And that paper talks a lot about how you put on your Australian work and you do get really good audiences for it. They really are good, you know, good box office. So the idea that you can't attract audiences to big new Australian works that are important and vital is actually shot in the in the money.
Melbourne Theatre Company, regarded by many as the enemy of all goodness in the world, but actually, you know, has a hugely important thing that it's played throughout its entire history about its commitment to new Australian writing, where its biggest sellers year after year after year have been the new Australian plays. You program a Joanna Murray Smith play at whatever theatre company, and you know that it's going to sell out. You know that writer's going to walk away with a royalty check big enough to buy a house, and rightly so. So there's believe in those things.
And you generate press and all of that sort of stuff, because you have writers that are talking about the times and starting to lead the debate in that kind of way as well from a kind of media perspective. And so it's much easier to get the work out there anyway, because they are saying something new and there's something to report on there.
Yeah.
I think I would concur with all of that. I'm just trying to pick up on threads. I'm on the National Playwrights Committee at the moment, the Writers Guild Committee, and that's an assortment of people from around the country. No one from Tasmania yet, but I've been pushing that barrow a little bit.
we have Queensland pushing our barrow.
I'm a Darwin boy, I get that. I get being marginal. I get that. I do. One of our things has been to push for the profile of the playwright again, and the committee was formed in a way to push back against that. Against that that early '90s trend towards the auteur-driven model. You know, the director as the creator of Chekhov, etc., that Tim was just referencing. And I think the pendulum's coming back again. I think that there's a move coming back to playwriting. I think that even the companies that decided they were going to go down the group devised or physical or music theatre approach, that diversification of forms, I think that even within those sorts of companies, there's been a kind of a balance, a swing back to playwriting. So that's something that I feel a little bit more optimistic about than I did 5 years ago, a little less defensive about than I did 5 years ago.
Can I just, sorry to interrupt, I also think there's there's a blurring of the lines which I find really exciting. There's no longer devised work or text work, and we're starting to see the place of the writer in those processes become vital. I think it's juicy.
Yeah. One thing that I know that is happening, where there are large cast plays happening, is in the independent sector. You know, where it's volunteers, 20 men, you know, being a football club in Spencer's parties in Brisbane, or you know, 20 university students being the Barton Meinhof game in Ben Adams plays, you know, so that work has been written, but it's been pushed into the margins. I would say that another trend that has certainly taken place in Brisbane, but I suspect also in Melbourne and some other capital cities, is that the local playwright has kind of been pushed off the main stage and into that independent sector and into the add-on season, into the non-subscriber season, and you know, I remain concerned about that trend. I don't know whether you guys see that happen in your neck of the woods or not in your theatre company, obviously.
Yeah, but Griffin, for those who don't know, is where I work, is the kind of longest running, continuously producing company dedicated solely to Australian work, based out of Sydney. Now that Playbox has become Malthouse, sort of lost that focus. And we, like, I don't know, I used to work in Sydney Theatre Company, I had a bit of a break from new writing for a while, and then came back to work at Griffin. And I was kind of in the same sort of feeling as Tim, that it's in a really great kind of state. But we used to kind of sort of struggle in a way to fill a season at the SDC, and then a few years later, there's so many great works out there that, you know, if Griffin was twice the size and had to program twice as much, it'd be really easy. I know that previously, thinking to get 4 plays together in a season was actually quite difficult at that scale. So I think it's in excellent health as well. But it's kind of interesting to come back and see that a lot of the same complaints still kind of persist, and it would be great to have those occupy less of the chat and kind of focus on what is really good and the opportunities that are out there. Yeah, even the independent scene, I'm not sure, because I'm not so familiar with what's happening over there, but we're getting a lot of submissions from people from interstate, from independent companies wanting to bring the works to Sydney through the stables, and that's really kind of promising. And I think if that was a more robust kind of network like that, being in the independent sector wouldn't be as onerous as it kind of currently is. I think it's a great scope for that.
I agree, and I think I don't know which session to make this observation on, but may as well make it now. I think that probably, and you know, it's been said for a while, the days of the garret writer are kind of gone. You know, and the most empowering thing that any of us can take with us is the idea of being a self-producer, and to think of ourselves as companies, not in the corporate sense, but you know, as producers or co-producers or co-presenters of our own work. I think that's a really empowering way forward, and I think that's what a lot of companies are doing, are entering into co-presentation and co-producing models. And there's a great regional network happening there that I need to have a conversation with Annette about to learn more about myself later in the day. I had another thought there that was running off that, but it's gone.
Yeah, it's session later.
Oh, okay. We'll talk about that.
I think there's one massive elephant in the room, and it's not even an elephant, but no one is doing anything to rephrase. There's a massive diversity problem in the Australian playwriting community. It's embarrassing, and it's not being universally addressed as a community and as an industry and as an artistic opportunity. So I think we talk about diversity as a kind of deficit economy. There's a problem that we must fix, rather than there's an opportunity here to create a body of stories that reflect the Australia that we actually live in. And the fundamental philosophical turnaround of that is something that needs to happen. It needs to happen immediately. I've now had exactly the same conversation with alarming regularity that has not really moved on at all from when I started maybe 3 years ago, and from everyone who I've spoken to about it, hasn't actually moved on for 20 years. Here's the numbers. Last year, 3% of the new plays on the Australian stage were by Indigenous, sort of by culturally diverse playwrights, and 3% 3% culturally diverse, 4% Indigenous.
What are the obstacles, Tim?
They're huge. They're huge obstacles, and that's why we're still having exactly the same conversation here. The first is perceived lack of excellence, and I think this is the greatest of them all. If I have another conversation with an artistic director of a theatre company, anything from one of the biggest theatre companies in the country to a tiny, small company that says, show me the great Asian Australian play and I'll do it tomorrow, then I say, what are you doing to find the next great Asian Australian play? And the challenge is that we're talking about work that's going to require a generation with artistic directorships that are only accountable to their audience during their tenure. So it's just not worth my while as the artistic director of Roseman Theatre Productions, State Theatre Company of Roseman, to spend those 3 years investing the meagre amount of development resource that I have in creating a robust, buoyant group of Asian Australian or Lebanese Australian or Afghani Australian writers to get them good enough to be, quote, competitive at a main stage level, because I'm never going to see the fruit of that work. So there's a real lack of vision and opportunity from the leadership to kind of just take it for the culture rather than for their tenure. It's a real problem. There are absolutely notable exceptions, and the leading of them is Lee Lewis, Griffin, without question. That's the first one. Secondly, there aren't any role models for writers from those communities. Lots of us in this, let's acknowledge that this is an entirely Anglo room. We come to that because it's in our cultural DNA to go to the theatre. I was brought up going to the theatre. I had a love of theatre from a small age. I stood outside at the age of 9, the original cast of Les Miserables, and said, I'm not going to like it, it's not by Andrew Lloyd Webber. But I was taken to the theatre as a small boy, you know, and it's entirely formed my existence. And here I am now, you know, working for a theatre company. If you don't have that, then there's nothing to lead you to it. And so if you don't have those people to look up to and to aspire to emulate, and actually to aspire to be better than, then how do you create that work? So I'll talk later about
Just throw a cat among the pigeons, and I acknowledge what you're saying about the percentage of Indigenous and culturally diverse playwrights, but I'm sure I speak for most of us here when we say everything seems to be very Melbourne and Sydney centric as well, and hats off to Blue Cow for, you know, working to promote Tasmanian playwrights, because we're only 2% of the population of the country as well. You know,
2% of Australia.
Tasmanians are about 2.5% of Australia's population.
Basically, we're Bondi.
Right, exactly. Well, really, but you know, I was at the Playwriting Festival in Sydney last June, and I was chatting to a few other participants who were from regional Victoria and elsewhere. And of course, being in Sydney, you're going to have a lot of Sydney-based participants just because of convenience, but it very much felt like we were at a Sydney festival, and you know, regional Australian participants are just not seen in big cities unless we pull up stumps and go there and we become Melbourne and Sydney people.
It's interesting you say that.
Yeah.
Only one of the featured playwrights on the programme at that festival was a Sydney playwright. But the perception is that it's all about Sydney, or it's all about Melbourne. And it's understandable, 70% of the submissions that we get are from writers based in Sydney and Melbourne, because that's where 70% of the playwrights live.
That's where 35% of the population lives between
sure.
Sydney and
So dependent upon audience as well. You know, like
Yeah.
how do you get a vibrant industry unless you're selling tickets? And you know, when you're in a set small population centres, it's really difficult to sustain that stuff.
Yeah, and certainly for that work to be notable enough to get beyond its home life. One of the reasons that everyone knows the doll is because it's been done everywhere for decades. How do you get, you know, it's the second production question that's
And I think there's also that problem, and we're going to move on very shortly to the next session, because otherwise we're going to get incredibly hard time at the beginning of the day. There's also that problem which I'm wrestling with, and hoping today that somebody will say something at some point that will kind of go ping in my brain and solve my problem. That through Blue Cow and programs like the Cowshed, you kind of go, okay, so, you know, we'll produce this one play by this one playwright, and then they've had their chance, and next year I'm going to have to do something by another playwright. But how do you ever develop as a playwright? How do you grow as a playwright if you only get your one play done, but then the next one you write, they bring it along to me and I go, oh no, you've had your bite of the apple.
Yeah.
You know, I'm going to do somebody else's play next year because I have to share it around. It's very, very difficult in a place this big. You know, it's very hard. Which is why I can see Sean, you know, with Sleeping Dogs. I mean, ultimately, you just put them on yourself, you know, and good on you, you know. But then that becomes
that's difficult on a national level, not just on a regional level as well. Because we have exactly the same sort of thing in Griffin. We've got a limited number of slots and a massive number of playwrights, and that the same playwrights might be producing plays that could easily be programmed there, but for the same reasons.
Because I think that's the other thing that needs to be said about being a playwright is that, it is a, you know, you learn from the, I mean, I'm sure every playwright has plays in their bottom drawer that they wrote when they were 14 that they don't want anybody to see now, you know, say looking at film. Yes, exactly, yeah. But you need the productions of plays that don't work.
Yeah.
As well. You need the productions of the plays that at the end of it you go, well that didn't work, but we all learned something from that, didn't we?
There's a theatre in New York called Signature. Has anyone heard of Signature Theatre in New York? They make a commitment to a playwright, not to a play, to a playwright. They take you on for 3 years and they guarantee that they will do a show of yours every year in your tenure.
God,
whether it's shit or whether it's extraordinary, you know, and that's, you can do that because it's New York, and there's the culture for it, and there's the...
That's where the self-starter model that I'm talking about is handy. You know, you have to produce your own work. You have to, you know, I think, you know, you have to make those mistakes yourself in a way.